Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How do you do? Good. Lecture 7 is about to start. But first, a reminder, there will be no physical lecture here in Norske tomorrow due to an exercise that's taking place. There's another exercise taking place, I must remind you, that has a deadline tomorrow, 1800. I hope you are prepared to submit that one. But on Thursday and Friday, we'll be here as normal. Also, if you check the Canvas site, I have put out some information. I'm offering a short historical walk and talk tomorrow at noon, 11:30 to 1300, because it's nice weather tomorrow, little wind, high temperature. Sorry if you can't say what. We'll see on Thursday and Friday how the weather forecast is. If it's possible, we'll have another opportunity then. But at least tomorrow I'm going to take 1.5 hours walk in the neighborhood and talk a little bit about the cultural heritage and history of Longyearbyen. Today's theme is about the industrial era on Svalbard. From Søren Zakariassen to Store Norske. Søren Zakariassen, some of you will know who is. He's perhaps the pioneer of coal mining on Svalbard. Store Norske, everybody knows who Store Norske is. There are others we're going to touch upon as well. During the first half, I shall talk about this pioneer phase before really industrial. It's before we can say that Svalbard is industrialized. It's these pioneering explorers, prospecting for different minerals, not only coal. The so-called coal rush that developed in the years from approximately 1900 and until the outbreak of World War I in 1914. There were a lot of prospectors from different countries claiming also areas for future mining activity. I'll talk specifically about the most important coal mining company, namely the Arctic Coal Company, an American Norwegian company that started its activity here where we are right now in Longyearbyen. And then I'll hopefully have time at the end of the first half to talk about the Svalbard Treaty and the years after the treaty had been signed in Paris, not from a political point of view, but more as a game changer for how mining was going to be in the future. We'll have a separate lecture on the political history tomorrow. So this is the first half, and then in the second half, I'm going to talk more about the industrialized Svalbard from the 1920s and particularly the 1930s on and up to our time. What happened here during the Second World War, the recurring economic crisis and crisis in the coal mining industry internationally, how coal mines came to be nationalized, that is taken over by the state. They used to be private companies, they were taken over by the state. How things changed in around 1990 when there was an economic policy shift, yet another crisis in the coal mining industry, and when the government started to think about alternative activities, economic activities, to keep people on Svalbard. And then I'm going to talk about we are about to enter into the post-industrial era on Svalbard. It's getting closer and closer. Gruve 7, the last remaining coal mine of Norske, is bound to close down in September next year. And coal mining will be over on the Norwegian side. It's strange, yeah. Right. Problem, always a problem. This is this hand, and on the other hand, how shall we look upon coal mining or industrial activity in the long run? Has it been a blessing for Svalbard or a curse for Svalbard? So it's a matter of discussion. I won't provide the definite answer, of course, on that one. That's up to you to do. Yeah. Today we're talking about mining, so it comes probably as no surprise that this has to do with mining. But what is it? Anyone been to mine number 3? Perhaps? This is an item from Svalbard Museum. You can think a little bit about it, what it is, and then you, of course, get the answer at the end of the lecture. Mining pioneers. The knowledge that there were coal and other minerals on Svalbard is very old. Even the first visitors to Svalbard, or nearly the first visitors, first expeditions in the beginning of the 17th century, they noticed that there were coals to be found. They could be seen on the beaches. They found also other metals, lead. They saw other minerals of possible interest, but the whalers had no use for that. One could perhaps imagine that the whalers, when they were having these try works, these factories where they produced train oil, that they would need coal to fire their furnaces. But in fact, they didn't. They brought with them firewood from the mainland. And as soon as they got the fire going under their big coppers, they just kindled the fire with the remains from of the blubber. So they had no use for this coal. Also, hunters and trappers knew that there were coal available. In some places in Svalbard, you can just go along the beach and carve some coal out of there's a coal face just above the beach. So it's out in the open, not difficult at all. And some of the trappers and hunters may have, or we know that we have documentation that some of them actually took some coal and used them in their stoves in their huts. And some of them even brought back some sacks of coal back to the mainland. But this was very, very small scale private initiative. The first coal mine, or something called a coal mine, is the so-called Diana coal mine from 1869. There's an illustration there from a trial account by a Scotsman called James Lamont, who had his own ship, the Diana. For those of you who are sharp-eyed, you can see down on the bay there is the ship. It had a steam engine. He used to come to Svalbard, travel widely around, hunting, sporting, as the British call it, sport. But since he had a steam engine on board, of course, it was very practical for him to have coal deposits on Svalbard for bunker coal. And a man of reading. Lamont read, of course, the publications of geologists and researchers that operated on Svalbard at that time, so he knew there were coal available. So he sent some people ashore up in Kongsfjorden. We know he dug some coal, and also here in Longyearbyen. And this is or it was known as Longyearbyen at that time, but this is the so-called Diana coal mine. You can see them with pickaxes and probably use some dynamite, blasting and filling sacks of coal. It's up in the hillside. I think we have a pretty good idea where this coal mine actually is. This is a photograph of the previous mine inspector, Bergmester, Peter Brugmans. I was on a trip with him where we went around looking for where this Diana coal mine might have been. And this deposit here is of new date, of course, but this coal seam that is visible here is just below mine number 3, between mine number 3 and the seed vault in the hillside there. And that makes sense according to the picture we see in Lamont. Probably they were in that region digging coal for their ship. This is remains of probably Store Norskes activity in the area. At least this expert, Peter Brugmans, he convinced me that this was probably where the old Diana coal mine was. And none of you have forgotten, of course, Adolf Erik Nordenskiöld, our ever-returning friend from Sweden, who was active in many ways as a scientist first and foremost, but also as an industrialist. He formed Svalbard's first industrial company, AB Isfjorden, Aksjebolaget Isfjorden, based on a deposit of phosphorus minerals that he found on Kaptorsen. Now, why was that interesting? You may ask, and I may answer. It's, of course, fertilizer. This was a period of time at the end of the 19th century where artificial fertilizer became in demand in the modernizing agriculture. So he found phosphorus minerals here, guano, bird shit, fossilized bird shit, that's what it is, that he imagined could be mined and sold on the mainland. And he envisaged also that he might establish a colony in this area, preferably manned by Norwegians, who could hunt a little bit, dig some phosphorite, mine some phosphorite, and also do scientific observations. For this purpose, he applied to the Swedish government for protection, because this was no man's land. He wanted to protect the area. So he asked the government for some kind of protection, a declaration of that this was an area protected by the Swedish government. That sparked a political process that we are coming back to at another point. This industrial company remained a paper tiger, never produced anything. A later expedition found out that the deposit was so small it had no commercial value at all. But it was registered as an industrial company, and in this case, the first on Svalbard. But as you saw in the title of this lecture from Søren Zakariassen, this is a picture of Søren Zakariassen in his older days, sealing captain, Arctic pilot from Tromsø, had been on Svalbard many, many times as a skipper, as a sealer, but he was also an industrial entrepreneur. In 1899, he took his boat, a yacht, Gottfried, together with 2 or 3 of his sons and a small crew. And they sailed to Svalbard for the specific purpose to dig coal. He had sailed around the archipelago. He knew that there were coals available in many places. Originally he had been thinking of going east on Spitsbergen. And we know that there are coal on the southeast of Spitsbergen. There are coal deposits, but there was so much ice in Storfjorden that year. So instead, he went to, ironically, Isfjorden on the west coast, where he also knew that there were coals available. And he went to this place here on the map called Boemannneset on the northern side of Isfjorden, and also at the entrance to Grønfjorden, where Barentsburg is today, in the vicinity of the helicopter base there at Herodden, where he mined coal. Approximately a ton of coal. No, more than that. 100 tons. And this he did for commercial purposes. He was planning on filling the boat with coals and taking it back to Tromsø. I see I write 50 to 80 tons of coal. 600 or 6,000 liters, 60,000 liters of coal will be some 50 to 80 tons, depending on the quality. He was actually able to sell some of that coal locally, because when he was there in 1899, in the summer of 1899, there was a research vessel in Isfjorden at that time, anchored here in Adventfjorden. That was a French, or rather a ship from Monaco, the Princesse Alice. That was the research vessel of the great-grandfather of the previous captain of Monaco's bobsleigh team. And then you know who it was. Prince Albert of Monaco. He used to be a skipper on the Olympic bobsleigh team of Monaco. His great-grandfather was, Albert I, was a great marine scientist and oceanographer. And if you've been to Monaco, you know there is a great museum there, a marine and oceanographic museum. Albert I visited Svalbard, I think, 5 times with his ship. So he bought some of the coals from Søren Zakariassen. The rest of it he took back to Tromsø and sold partly to private consumers, partly to the new electricity plant that had started in Tromsø, and partly to Max Brewery in Tromsø. So possibly they produced beer on the first Svalbard coal in 1899. Interesting. Now, he didn't stop with that. He was also an entrepreneur, because on the basis of his expedition in 1899, he formed a company in Tromsø and also initiated companies in Trondheim, in Christiania, and in Bergen. So there were a number of small mining companies that were established in the years from 1900 to 1902, Norwegians. One of these companies in Adventfjorden, on the south side of Adventfjorden, was a company that was set up in the highly and very significant city of Trondheim in Norway, where they formed a coal company called Trondheim Spitsbergen Coal Company. with all the mightiest industrialists in Trondheim at that time. There were 3 butchers and a carpenter who was behind this coal mining company. They sent expeditions to Arlov, looking, prospecting for coal. Can you see where this is? You can see Hotel Nessa down there. This is the harbor, the small boat harbor. It's an old picture, so you don't see all the containers and things like that. And there's Blomsterdalen going up here. Now, if you go up that ridge, follow the ridge, up to nearly under the top of the plateau mountain, you will find a small mine entrance, which is probably the first coal mine in this area, made by Spitsbergen Coal Company, which was then later bought by the Americans. Coming back to that. Also on the other side of the fjord, right across the fjord, a company from Bergen prospected for coal. That was later sold to a British company, those occupations. So this is the period we call the coal rush from 1900 and until the beginning of World War I, when people came from not only Norway, but from many other countries as well, to look for minerals that could be mined, and also to more or less to speculate in occupying areas that could later be developed and sold to others. One of these examples is the Spitsbergen Coal and Trading Company, which bought the occupations of this Bergen coal company that was established in 1902 and built the first mining settlement on Svalbard, namely the so-called Advent City. There was a question here, not in the chat, okay? The Spitsbergen Coal and Trading Company, they had the first wintering on Svalbard in a coal settlement. And these buildings that you see here, at least most of them, they are actually still in the area, but not on Revneset. They were moved further in 1918, they were moved further in the fjord, and they can be seen right across the bay in Jotun. The buildings, the old buildings that you see there, they were moved from Advent City further out the fjord. When this company was bankrupt, they were bought by a Norwegian coal mining company and re-established in Jotun, which is an example. Many examples where buildings are moving around on Svalbard. This British company had many problems, but not least they had working or labor unrest, problem with their workers. Probably because there were clash of cultures. The living conditions were not actually very pleasant. They had to winter without most conveniences, isolated during the winter. British leadership, Scandinavian workers, all sorts of trouble. So there were strikes and unrest. Sometimes, or a few times, the company just took the whole staff and sent back to the mainland and put some of them to trial in Norwegian courts. Because there was no law and order on Svalbard. This was no man's land. So there were a lot of conflicts, and also the coal deposits were not that promising. So this was a short-lived adventure. Before the First World War, quite a few claims were taken. Occupations were done in this manner that they just went around pulling steel string or putting up signs that says that this area described geographically so and so, witnessed by a few people. This land has been occupied by a person or a company. And when they got back to the mainland, they would report that to their own government, which could do nothing but to register the claim. Most of this is an example of such a claim post being set up. Koptorsen, actually, this one. Cool guy. Yeah. Sunglasses and everything. Yeah. Very little production. They dug small pits to see whether there was just like this, to see whether there was a deposit of something that could be developed into a coal mine, but very little produced. You have to invest in quite a lot of infrastructure to actually produce something. So that was a challenge. One can ask whether this was pure speculation or serious business. Some of those prospectors had no plans of actually starting production, starting mining. They were out there to occupy areas that later could be sold. This was typical of the gold rush in Australia and Canada and California and the same. Not everybody were miners. Some of them were just speculators. One of the most expansive of these people, these prospectors, was Ernest Richard Mansfield, who is linked to the company Northern Exploration Company, a British company. He had a fascinating biography, because as a young man he had emigrated from England to New Zealand, later Australia, as a young man. I think he was 16 years old or something like that, and worked as a so-called landlooker, a property developer, but also looking for coal mines, digging for gold in New Zealand and Australia. When he didn't do that, he worked as a journalist. He had his own newspaper. That was had as his target group were these landlookers and property developers. He was also a banjo instructor. So he was a man of many talents. He actually also wrote romantic novels. So this was a man of many facets. He even went to Canada during the gold rush there. But at some point early in the 20th century, around 1901, 1902, he came back to England and settled in the south of England, where he got acquainted with the local doctor and the local parson, who had been on Svalbard as tourists. They were also amateur geologists. And they came back with samples from Svalbard and naturally called on Mr. Mansfield, the renowned expert and gold digger. And there's a story about these three friends gathering in the rectory, possibly after a better dinner, and where these the doctor, Dr. Salter, and the priest Gardner pulled out this bag of rock samples and poured it over the table, and Mr. Mansfield examined them and looked closely at the samples and said, "Gold, or I'm a Dutchman." They had found gold, or so it would seem. Now, is that possible? I think, could I have found gold on Svalbard? Well, there is gold on Svalbard. There are people who have, in Store Norske, had a daughter firm called Store Norske Gull. They found gold north of Ny-Ålesund, and also in Sankt Jonsfjorden there is a deposit of gold. Sankt Jonsfjorden here, and also the so-called Swanson Formation north of Ny-Ålesund. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to start a new industrial operation on that deposit. That would not be allowed probably by the environmental authorities. But it's possible that they actually found gold. It's also possible that it was a scam. Anyway, in 1905, Mansfield went back to Svalbard, traveling around the west coast in particular, and occupying new areas. And these are only a few of the places where they had this company had activity. Here in the Kongsfjorden area, both on the south side and the northern side, so-called New London. And they were very active here in the Belzun area, both on the north side, down in the Skjærsfjorden, and numerous sites where they found different things: iron, coal, asbestos, things like that. This company claimed ownership or claimed occupancy of 10,000 square kilometers on Svalbard, which is a sixth of the whole territory of Svalbard. Far and wide, and not everywhere, of course, there were minerals to be found. They were just enormously expansive. Later, when the various companies had to register their claims, there was a premium on every claim that they registered. They would have to file it to the commission. And then they reduced it to some 1,500 square kilometers. But that's still quite a lot. That's about half of what, for instance, Store Norske has today. So it was very expansive. At that time, Ernest Mansfield, by the way, had been removed from the company. This Northern Exploration Company, around 1920, had a stock of shares worth about £1 million, £1 million British pounds, enormous amount of money at that time. But they hardly produced anything. But it says in the firm, in the name of the firm, it's an exploration company. They were exploring, they were not a producing, first and foremost, company. They were also very active politically around the time of the Svalbard Treaty to preserve their interests and trying to engage the British government to support their claims in Svalbard. So a very interesting company, this. Not quite representative of all the companies that were active here. But what is interesting to note, that during this coal rush period until World War II, this coincided, this land claims coincided with national policies as well. Or rather, it was the companies that tried to mobilize their governments to take interest in Svalbard in order to preserve their economic interests. There's a question here, Ernest Mansfield, why was he removed? Well, it had to do with the, in 1913, the company hired a mining expert from the United States to look at one of the mines that they had there, a marble quarry in what is called New London or Blomstrandhalvøya, north of Ny-Ålesund, where they had invested in a lot of machinery and a lot of equipment, steam engines, houses, production equipment. And then this American expert was used as consultancy to evaluate the prospects of this site. And he concluded that it was absolutely worthless. And after that, Mansfield was removed from the company. But the company kept on growing with other directors. Now, this about the territorial ambitions. It's important to bear in mind that these were parallel processes. Suddenly, Svalbard was visited by actors from many different nations: England, United States, Germany, Scandinavian countries. And they tried to have their own governments back home back them up in their claims. This is no man's land. Remember, until 1920, this is no man's land. So in order to secure their claims and economic interests, they needed the support, political support. That's why they tried to mobilize their governments. The governments, on the other hand, were at this time engaged in a diplomatic and political process to discuss the question of administration on Svalbard that we're going to talk about tomorrow. So in terms of industrialization, things went rather slowly. These pioneer companies did not produce very much. They were undercapitalized, most of them. Adventurous, expansive, but with quite little capital. There was one exception, and that exception was the Arctic Coal Company, formed in 1906. The Arctic Coal Company was headed by an American industrialist called John Monroe Longyear, after whom this place is named, of course. He was approached by Norwegians from in this circuit around this Trondheim Spitsbergen Coal Company, this Norwegian firm, who tried to interest him in investing in a coal mine on Svalbard. Longyear himself had been visiting Svalbard as a tourist on board one of these tourist steamships in 1901 with his family. So he had seen with his own eyes that there were coals to be found here, because he was on shore here in Adventfjord. And just by walking on the beaches and around the creeks, he could see remains of coal. So he knew that there were coal. And when this Norwegian small company offered their claim to be sold, he of course made his investigations as to whether this was feasible, but he ended up buying out these Norwegians, or rather including them in a new company that was called the Arctic Coal Company, registered in Boston, United States in 1906. And from the summer of 1906, they started building this settlement that is now Longyearbyen. First thing they did was to send up a boat, build a simple pier, and then get equipment on board. And if we're lucky tomorrow, we can go and see where all this happened, this first phase. It was his nephew, Monroe, who was leading the operation, but he died during a shipwreck. So John Monroe Longyear had to take over much of the leadership in this company by himself. In the course of 10 years, this company invested some $1 million American. And by 1915, when they quit, there were some 200-300 people employed, more in the summer when all the construction work was going on, less than 200 during the winter when coal was produced, but this was a year-round operation. And he had developed this place until it had a production capacity of nearly 50,000 tons of coal per year, which was many times as much as all other coal companies put together on Svalbard. This was by far the biggest, most professional. And the main production mine was up in the hillside. You can see remains of the loading up in the hillside above the church on that side of the valley. And the mine was up there. Unfortunately, that later exploded, that mine, in 1920. But still there are some remains of the loading station up there. So they produced coals for sale mostly in Norway. They were very active, and just after 3 or 4 years, they had electrified coal production in the mines. They built an electricity plant. There were street lights, electric lights in town, and they also had electrical boring equipment in the mines. So they expanded rapidly. But then came the war in 1914, and things became very complicated. There were all sorts of restrictions on equipment and provisions and things like that. And also it was very heavy ice in the winters, or the summers rather, of 1914, 1915. So he decided to evacuate while the war was going on. And during World War I, in 1916, he sold all his properties, including the mine here in Longyearbyen and the supply of coal that had been produced, to a Norwegian syndicate that later became Store Norske Spitsbergen Kull Company. Store Norske was registered on the 30th of November 1960 and took over a more or less not finished, but fully developed coal mine from the Americans. Longyear continued to be a shareholder in the company, by the way, until this, and was probably the biggest shareholder in Store Norske until his death in 1922. In the 1920s then, after World War I, we find these coal mines here, just as the war ended. In Ny-Ålesund, there was production, just started, Kings Bay. Here in Adventfjorden, on both sides, there was on the Jotunheim side, the Spitsbergen Kullfelter, and here Store Norske. There was in Grumant, a British-Russian company. Here in Barentsburg, that was a Dutch company. Swedes here in Svea, and also on Bjørnøya, further south, where that picture is from Tunheim on Bjørnøya, in the early 1920s. But then the economic crisis struck, and very soon most of these companies had to lay off. They were closed down. When come 1930s, only 2 actors were still operating coal mines on Svalbard. The Russians, or the Soviets rather, from 1932, who operated in Barentsburg and Grumant, and Store Norske, who operated here in Longyearbyen. The rest had either temporarily or permanently quit during the economic crisis. Before we take a break, I'll show you a map where different sites on the west coast, mostly of Svalbard, where there were test pits exploring various minerals, and where there were actually coal mines. You can see it's mostly concentrated in the area from Belsund and up to Ny-Ålesund. That was where the activity was. There are quite a few places where there was activity. If you visit these places now, except for the modern settlements, what you see is perhaps a couple of houses, a small, narrow railroad that they use for transporting things. Maybe you find a small hole in the ground that used to be the shaft, a small a sample of tools and things like that, but not very much. It's only in these settlements, Longyearbyen, Grumant is now a ruin, Barentsburg and Ny-Ålesund and Sveagruva, that there was some substantial activity. Right. Then we take a 15 minutes break. Okay. Ready for the last section of the lecture, second half. A new legal framework. Remember what I've said now numerous times, Svalbard was no man's land. All this activity of claiming areas on Svalbard took place under a lack of a regime, which was also the case many other places in the world, in Klondike, in California, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Very often the prospecting for minerals took place in areas where there was no property rights established or no regime to regulate this. So it had to be made up along the way. But at least in those other states, there was a national government, there was a general authority, a central government. No such things on Svalbard. That was, of course, a problem. There were different conflicts that arose as a result of the prospecting activity. There were land conflicts, that is, conflicts over who owned the claim, as it were. This picture here, unfortunately hidden by the photo, it says Spitsbergen Green Harbour, a protest. That was this British company, the Northern Exploration Company, that put up one of the first oil rigs on Svalbard. This was oil, drilling for oil and gas. There is actually, in the Grønfjorden area, in Finneset, there is, have been reports, there have been later drillings as well. There's reported hydrocarbons in this area. Rather primitive oil rig, you might say. But anyway, the Brits placed their oil rig on a claim that had been made by Store Norske already in 1920. So Store Norske, when they heard that the British had established themselves there, they went over to Grønfjorden by boat, of course, took with them their heftiest, hardest, muscled coal miners to stop the British from interfering. Also, these labor conflicts I mentioned in Advent City, there were strikes and conflicts between the workers and the management. The same went for the Arctic Coal Company. That was written by many labor conflicts. You have to remember that these years before World War I, that was also a period when the labor movements started to organize. This was a radical period in many ways. You know, just prior to the Russian Revolution. So there were syndicalists, there were anarchists, there were communists, socialists, and everybody was trying to organize the workers. So this was in general, in Europe in particular, in general, a very radicalized period with a lot of conflicts on the labor market. And Svalbard was no exception, because these workers came from the mainland, inspired by those thoughts, and meeting with different employers' cultures, British cultures, American cultures that had very little sympathy for socialist ideas. Problems were bound to arise. Anyway, these conflicts, these problems that arose gave rise to the so-called administration question. Who were going to solve these conflicts? There were no local authorities on Svalbard. There was no single nation that took responsibility for law and order on Svalbard. So the only opportunity the companies had, if they wanted to prosecute their workers, was to bring them either back to their homeland or back to Norway and try to put them to court there. And that happened quite a few times. In Tromsø, the courts in Tromsø, they treated a lot of cases that concerned Svalbard. But they had no jurisdiction on Svalbard, of course, but what they could have a trial about were labor contracts between employers and workers, of course. So this was also used as a motive or a pretext, some would say, for the Norwegian, newly had separated from Sweden in 1905, to put the Spitsbergen question on the agenda. How do we solve this administration question? So it started a process of diplomatic initiatives. There were, before World War I, there were 3 conferences in Oslo, or Christiania, as it was known as at that time, trying to solve this administration question. I'm going to talk at length about those tomorrow. But all these processes, the diplomatic and political processes, they were curbed by the outbreak of the war. That stopped everything. And actually, the last conference was in 1914. And as they were closing the conference, war broke out by the shots in Sarajevo. You probably heard about in the summer of 1914. During the First World War, the situation on the ground changed here on Svalbard. Until that time, many companies, different countries, had been operating in this area. But during the war, a number of Norwegian coal mining companies were formed, new companies were formed. Norske was one of them, Kings Bay another, Bjørn AS, AS Norske Kullfeltet. There were 5 or 6 companies that were established during the war. And they were the only ones that had, or almost the only ones, there were Swedes in Sveagruva also, that had activity on Svalbard during the First World War. So when the war ended, Norwegian economic interests that were in minority, minuscule before World War I, they were now becoming dominant. In 1920, the Svalbard Treaty, or the treaty concerning the Spitsbergen archipelago, was signed in Paris on the 9th of February. And 5 years later, the Norwegian government, or Norway, took over formally sovereignty over Svalbard, thus ending more than 300 years of a status of no man's land. Now, the first thing the Norwegian government had to do, and also as a consequence of what is written in the treaty, was to establish law and order and rules by which coal mining and other kinds of mineral activities can take place. And that is the so-called mining code, in Norwegian Bergverksordningen, which is not a part of the Svalbard Treaty, but it is a document that is presupposed in the treaty. The treaty says that Norway should take the initiative to make a set of regulations under which mining activity can take place. And that is Bergverksordningen. And that also had to be negotiated with the different parties, because there are different kind of regulations around in Europe, but they managed to agree on that. And in 1925, at the same time that Norway took over sovereignty, also the mining code entered into action. And it's the mining code that regulates this exploitation of geological resources on Svalbard. It's not the treaty itself. The treaty says something about equal treatment and non-discrimination and taxes and things like that, but the practical things on how to get rights to do mining or exploration, that's written into the mining code. So that is a set of rules that are still active on Svalbard and important on Svalbard. One question then had to be solved after Norway had taken over sovereignty, after the treaty entered into force. The treaty was signed in 1920, but it entered into force in 1925. After that, and that is also written into the treaty, all the possibly conflicting land claims had to be solved. The property questions had to be solved. And a special commissioner was named. He was Danish, a Danish jurist, Christian Sindballe, who was assisted by the Norwegian Arlov. And the Svalbard commissioner had as his task to solve all these conflicting land claims. There were provisions in the treaty. If there were conflicts that could not be solved, there could be arbitration in a special court. But they managed to clear all the property rights without going to court within a period of 2 years. So in 1927, they were finished with this work and writing the property book of Svalbard, giving property to those who had legal claims. So that was in 1927 that work was done. I said during the previous half that in the 30s, only Soviet and Norwegian mines operated on Svalbard. Here in Longyearbyen, Norske operated. Sveagruva had been bought by Norske from the Swedes in 1933, but no production was going on there. In Ny-Ålesund, Kings Bay, the mines in Kings Bay had been closed down in 1929, so there was no mining going on there. So it was here in Longyearbyen, Norske's mine, and the Russian or the Soviet mines in Barentsburg and Grumman, the three places that were operating. Just before the outbreak of the Second World War, there were plans to start mining again in Ny-Ålesund, in Kings Bay. So there were actually a few workers and engineers in Ny-Ålesund in 1940-41, the planned opening of the mining again. But then the war came, and in 1941, the whole population of Svalbard was evacuated. The Russians or the Soviets were evacuated to Arkhangelsk in northern Russia, and the Norwegians were evacuated to United Kingdom, to Scotland first, and later to England. And that included everybody, even the hunters and trappers that were left on Svalbard. Nobody stayed behind, or actually one person stayed behind. That's an exception. He was not evacuated. He hid when the evacuation came, and he was picked up by the Germans who came a few days later. During the war, there were a lot of damages. I'm talking about in a later lecture. But what's interesting here, that right after the war, during the summer of 1945, the peace summer, the Norwegians started rebuilding the mines. They started rebuilding in Ny-Ålesund, Kings Bay. Here in Longyearbyen, very much had been damaged. You recognize possibly here Nybyen. This is Sverdrupbyen. Only this building here is left up in Sverdrupbyen. All these barracks were not actually only, they were damaged, somewhat damaged, but they were still there after the war. But then Norske burned them down under a fire drill in the 90s. But this was called Nybyen because it was the new town that was rebuilt after the war. When the mines were up in Gruve 2B, they rebuilt the town there. The whole old town, Longyear city, which is in the area around the church, today's church, had been completely devastated by the attack of the Germans in 1943. So everything had to be rebuilt. And they quickly did so in the Norwegian settlements, and the Russians came quite soon after. In 1946, they were back and rebuilt Grumant and Barentsburg, and also started to establish a new mine in Pyramiden, a third coal mine. And Pyramiden during the 50s was the one that had most attention from the Russians. Pyramiden is here, Grumant here, Barentsburg here, Kings Bay, Ny-Ålesund, Sveagruva, and Longyearbyen. So 6 places after the war there was coal mining or preparing for coal mining in those sites. So in many ways, this was a very optimistic time and happy times on Svalbard. There was a lot of optimism connected to the reindustrialization, as it were. But very soon, the economic crisis struck on a global scale, and it hit the coal industry very hard. A lot of coal mines in the late 50s, all over the world, actually, but particularly in Europe, had serious economic problems. And it had to do with a lot of things. It had to do with, for instance, there was much less demand of coal than it has been previously. Ships went over from steam to diesel, marine diesel, and oil. The trains went on diesel as well, or electricity. So steam engines for transportation was not so popular anymore. And also there was overproduction. After the war, cheap coals came in from both the United States and from Poland and Eastern Europe, where and that was brown coal for energy purposes. So it was a very difficult market in the late 50s. And that also hit on the Norwegian coal mines. It was so bad that in the beginning of the 1960s, there was question, at least in the Norwegian mines, we don't know too much about how the Russians thought about this or the Soviets thought about this, but in the Norwegian circuits, at least, there was question of whether the coal mines should be dismantled altogether, because it required so large subsidies from the state in order to continue. At this point, Store Norske operated, or they had closed down Sveagruva already because that was not profitable. So they operated mines here in Longyearbyen as a private company. Store Norske was a private company. The state had bought Kings Bay in 1933, so that was a state company. One private, one government owned. And of course, the economic reality was bad for both companies, whether private or public. So Svea closed for good in 1949, or not for good because it was reopened later, but for the after-war production at least, it closed in 1949. Grumant was closed down in 1962. In 1962 was also the year when the last of a series of accidents in Kings Bay's mines in Ny-Ålesund happened on the 5th of November in 1962, killed 21 persons, and that was the end of coal mining in Ny-Ålesund. It closed down exactly 1 year later in November 1963. So suddenly two of the sites were gone. Svea was gone, Grumant was gone, and Ny-Ålesund was gone as a coal mining community. But Store Norske prevailed, and the question was why? Because the economic situation had not changed. It was still a very difficult coal market. Even in Norway, the Labour government even constructed a coke production plant in Mo i Rana, Koks, to produce coke from coal for steel production and so on and so forth, just to be a customer for coals from Svalbard. So it was very important, obviously, for the Norwegian state to keep on having activity here. So why was Store Norske, a private company, allowed a lot of loans and subsidies and help from the Norwegian state? This has to do with the Cold War. This is strategic settlement. The Cold War, in a situation, there was a lot of tension and also building up tension in the north with the buildup of the Soviet North Fleet. The northern regions, the Arctic regions, with submarines and so on and so forth. Nuclear weapons testing on Norway Zemlya, for instance. This was becoming a region of tension. So Svalbard's strategic position was developing very rapidly after World War II. We'll come back to that in later. Now, here on Svalbard, you had a situation where the Soviets had 2 or 3 settlements on Svalbard. Of course, it was not a very promising prospect to stop Norwegian coal mining while there were between 2,500 and 3,000 Russians on Svalbard. So this was, for strategic reasons, it was important to keep up Norwegian activity. And what were the alternatives to coal mining? There were realistically none. There was hope in the 1970s in particular, that other activities could replace coal mining. First and foremost, petroleum activity. I'll talk about that tomorrow. Fisheries could perhaps provide the opportunities. In fact, it didn't. The trawlers, seagoing trawlers, they preferred going back to the mainland and deliver their catches there instead of building up a refinery activity on Svalbard. Coupled with this, you also had a government with a very ambitious industrial policy. It's like today, the Norwegian government, although it wasn't as rich as the Norwegian government is today, or the Norwegian state is today, it still had large ambitions to steer the economic policy and to govern with a firmness. So if there was a need to establish, for instance, a coke factory to provide a customer for Store Norskes coal, well, that was something the Labour government was willing to do. All these are reasons, of course, that Store Norske was kept alive. It had a lot to do with sovereignty. This is His Majesty King Arlov visiting Longyearbyen, just to underline the importance of Norwegian sovereignty on this archipelago during the Cold War. But there are limitations to everything. I mean, for how long could this go on? Could one be doing coal mining at any price? As far as we know, although we have a lack of information really about the economics of the Soviet activity, it's very difficult to think that they were more economically more sound or more profitable than the Norwegians were. They produced approximately the same amount of coal with twice as many people in the Soviet coal mines. And the Norwegian coal production was at deficit almost all the time since the 1920s. There were some years during the 30s when the company was quite prosperous, but at that time the state had saved them by refinancing the company because they were laden with debts in the 1920s. In 1976, the Norwegian state took the consequences of this situation and nationalized the Store Norske Spitsbergen Company. It bought 1/3 of the shares in 1974, and 1976 they used their majority holding position to cash out the other shareholders, or almost all the shareholders. I think there were 18 or 19 individuals left with the shares. Now, that was not for economic reasons, because they were using a lot of money on Store Norske in the form of loans and guarantees and things like that. So it was not purely for economic reasons. It was because Norwegian government wanted a firmer hand on the wheel with regard to community development on Svalbard. It wanted to control it. And until that time, Store Norske had owned everything in Longyearbyen. Had been although there was a Sysselmann here, Store Norske was virtually everything on Svalbard. Now the state wanted control over that themselves, and that was a main reason why they took over Store Norske at that time. Having taken over the coal company, they started what was then called a normalization of the local community. There was a famous white paper in the government in 1974-75, white paper number 39, Stortingsmelding 39, that envisaged the development in Longyearbyen. Longyearbyen was going to be transformed from what we call a company town, totally dominated by the industrial company, into more of a family community, or at least more family-friendly community. And the way they did that was, one thing, one started to build family housing. Up to that time, this was almost a complete male society. There were only a few women and children. They were usually spouses of management in the company. The workers, the miners, had no opportunity to bring their families to Svalbard. But that changed in the 1980s when they started family housing construction. So more people were able to bring their families. And also the state or the government officials, they expanded. The airport came, bringing with them a lot of employees. The telecommunications were expanded, the system expanded, school, hospitals, so on and so forth. And all the state employees, they were encouraged to take their families with them. So gradually, during the 1980s, this became more of a family community, still dominated by relatively young single males, but still a number of families were coming. I came here in 1982. Longyearbyen was completely dominated by the company at that time, but there were families, and gradually that number rose. The big shift, however, came in the 1990s. Again, Store Norske was in an economic crisis, a resource crisis and an economic crisis. And the government started a very forceful policy of trying to develop new strands of the economy, alternatives to coal mining. The coal company itself was split. So Store Norske, which used to run the whole community, it was split into one division that was to concentrate on coal mining, and one company that was to run the infrastructure in town, which was called Svalbard, a company owned by the state called Svalbard Samfunnsdrift, a forerunner of Lokalstyret today. And there was also a small business development company that formed in around 89, 90. And the government put a lot of economic incentives at disposal to start new businesses, private businesses as well, got support, and also other kinds of activity. For instance, higher education. So UNIS is a direct result of this new economic policy in the 1990s. In 1993, UNIS was opened with money provided by the Ministry of Industry, because this was a part of the economic makeover of Longyearbyen. Later it was, of course, taken over by the Ministry of Research and Education. So one was beginning to foresee that Svalbard was taking the step into a post-industrial age. One believed that the coal mining was on the decline and would eventually stop. So it was time now to change to other branches. In tourism, research and education, service industries. That was to replace. And a lot of resources were put into those sectors. The Russians experienced grave problems after 1990. The Soviet Union was dissolved in 1989. That had repercussions on the coal mining company that received far less money from the state than it had before. Pyramiden closed down in 1998 and was evacuated in a few months. They had serious accidents. They had you've probably heard about the air crash in 96 on Operafjellet, 141 people killed. The year after, in 1997, over 20 people were killed in the mines in an explosion in Barentsburg. So they experienced a lot of problems in there and reduced their presence on Svalbard. But as everybody was, or very many, was expecting coal mining to come to an end, Store Norske was able to get political support to open a new mine in Svea, the Svea Nord, from 2001. And they did that by presenting a project that said that by using modern technology, top-notch technology, on a deposit which was very mighty, 4 or 5 meters of coal in the Svea Nord, they would be able to produce coal at a profit. So instead of having to receive money from the state to produce coal, they were now able, or they said they were going to be able to produce with a profit. They got the money from the state to invest in the new mine, but from that day on, they were supposed to pay for their own expenditures. And actually that went quite well for a number of years due to very high, artificially high, perhaps, coal prices. They were very lucky striking the market at the right time, producing lots and lots of coal, thereby emptying the mine very rapidly. I think the politicians in Norwegian Parliament thought that this project was going to last for 20 years, but in fact, it lasted for 10 years. Then they had to design a new mine, Lunkefjell. That never came into operation because then the market was so bad, the government decided this is not sustainable, this is not viable. So they refused refinancing Store Norske, and since 2015, they have been cleaning up in Svea and Lunkefjell. Lunkefjell never came to production. Everything is removed now in the Svea region. Even the airport and the port is being removed. Nearly all houses are gone. All infrastructure is removed, and things are more or less restored to its original. A very costly environmental project. And now it seems we're into the end game, perhaps, at least on the Norwegian side. Store Norske has now decided that in September 2023, they are going to stop coal production in Gruvesju, the last remaining mine. There will hopefully, and at least from my point of view, hopefully there will be some activity in mine number 7, not least to take care of the cultural heritage that is connected to coal mining. But coal production will end. That means that the local energy plant will have to fire on something different than coal. It's now firing on coal. 1 year from now, 1.5 years from now, they will be changing over to diesel and eventually on renewable sources. Solar, wind, possibly thermal, ground thermal, geothermal energy. Hydrogen, perhaps, who knows? Interesting times. Interesting times. What the Russians will do, nobody knows. They hardly produce enough in Barentsburg to fire their own energy plant in Barentsburg. There's virtually no export of coals. They have technical problems there, and as far as I know, very little coal left. So they have also a few years now, or a decade or so, trying to rebuild their economy on based on tourism, research, education, and reduce the number of people. There used to be in Barentsburg, there used to be more than 1,000 up to 1,500 people living there in the heyday. Now there are some 400 living in Barentsburg. So how to conclude in this picture in the long run? Has coal mining been a blessing or a curse in the long run? Well, let's put the arguments on the balance. One thing that's for sure, that coal mining has been, until now, a very important basis, the most important basis for both Norwegian and Russian presence on Svalbard. It's very hard to imagine the size of Norwegian and Russian presence on Svalbard if it hadn't been for local industrial production of, and exploitation of mineral resources. What other industry would have had so many people engaged? And operating coal mines in the Arctic requires all sorts of specialities that you need here locally, because you cannot just import them from anywhere on a short notice, at least, because this is 500 kilometers away from the mainland. Since this activity, overground, underground, is so diverse, it is an almost ideal type of activity to keep a local community going. You will need all kinds of plumbers, electricians, builders, miners, of course, transportations, people. You need a hospital to cater for. That's in the mining code. Schools, so on and so forth. So a mine requires infrastructure and a variety of work that is the basis for a community. So what about the environmental side of this? And this might be more controversial. Coal mining is dirty. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, most of coal mining on Svalbard, as opposed to coal mining many other places, like in Australia or in Poland or Germany, it takes place underground. Most of the land use is underground. Of course, on the surface, there is infrastructures and there's loading facilities and things like that. But on the whole, it's quite concentrated. It's concentrated in the settlements, whereas most of the impacts on nature is below ground. So out of sight, not necessarily out of mind. I say it's limited land use, but that is compared to if you have open quarries of coal. You don't have that on Svalbard, it's underground. So, but compared to other places in China or in Poland or Australia, where you see these enormous areas that have been devastated by mining, open day mining, it is comparatively limited land use. One thing that's also certain is that this coal mining business has created the infrastructure we still use today. Without a coal production here, we wouldn't have a port, we wouldn't have an electricity plant, we wouldn't have roads, we wouldn't have an airport, at least not the size it is today. Virtually all the infrastructure that has been built on and modernized since the 1980s has been built by Norske here in Longyearbyen and by Google in the Russian settlements. Without coal mining activity, nobody would have had the idea to build a society or a local community this size. There might have been activity, research stations, things like that, but not a local community of this size. So in that respect, we should be grateful to coal mining. On the other hand, it's obvious that coal mining is a black hole with regard to economy. It has sucked resources out of both Russia and Norway, enormously costly. There is no way you can repay all those hundreds of millions of crowns that have been sunk into coal activity in Svalbard. The production can never pay for that. Also, it's pretty dangerous. Many people have died or have been injured in the coal mines. You know from reading the papers that coal mining is dangerous all over the world. Actually, it's less dangerous in many places here and particularly here in Longyearbyen, because it's the coal source or the mines are so much easier to ventilate. But Njålsund, for instance, was probably one of the world's most dangerous coal mines if you calculate deaths per produced tons of coal. Nearly 100 people died in working accidents in Njålsund, and they produced very little coal. Although I said on the one hand that is an ideal activity to ensure a stable, diverse settlement, it's inflexible tool for the government. And that has to do with coal mining needs long time perspectives. It needs to plan 10 years ahead. If they're going to open a mine that takes over from another mine, they need 10 years of planning and preparation until that mine opens. Consequently, it's not a very flexible tool. You can't decide from one year to another that you will stop this and start another thing. So it costs a lot of money to change your mind when you're based on coal mining. And obviously there are conflict with environmental interests, and that have been the case and we will talk more about the environmental regime tomorrow. Yeah, this contraption here is of course found inside, or was found inside coal mines, the classical coal mines, because this is a support rig for hand boring into the coal face. You got this thing and then you had the hand boring. So that was hand boring to make blasting holes in the coal face. Manual methods used until the 1920s in this case in Longyearbyen. Not used anymore, of course. Next time, sheriff on Svalbard, law and order in the wild, wild north, the establishment of environmental regime and policing. Remember tomorrow, digital lecture. Those of you who can join on the walk and talk tomorrow, I'll see you then. Otherwise, we'll see each other on Thursday.
Where do we meet tomorrow?
Outside the entrance, main entrance. Yep. 1.5 hours. Dress sharp.
Thank you.